During the past decade, there has been a steady increase in demand for nostalgic and retro media. This is evidenced in two different ways: communities that have appeared based around collecting the original media and technology, and the rise in markability in repackaging nostalgic products and aesthetics. 2017 saw Sony re-enter the records market after abandoning vinyl 30 years before, and recent years have seen an influx of classics and mini-console recreations that emulate old video games to work with new technology in a retro casing. An option on the Nintendo Classics even allows you to simulate the tubes of a CRT on your HD flat screen. Instagram and more professional sites such as Cinegrain intentionally downgrade and damage image quality to represent old film stock and Polaroid pictures. But the focus of this research is VHS and whether or not the outdated format is a dead format. Unlike the aforementioned examples, VHS is a little more underground. VHS has a dedicated collector's following known as tape heads. This following has sparked documentaries such as Adjust Your Tracking and VHS Massacre, web series like Video Hoarders, and countless blogs and online videos. VHS also made news in May 2011 when a copy of Tales from the Quad Dead Zone sold for $700 and since for $2,000. Yet whilst VHS tapes remain for the dedicated collectors in online communities and thrift stores, the VHS aesthetic has been creeping into the mainstream, with YouTube and Skillshare offering countless tutorials on creating digitized analog VHS filters and HMV's recent Blu-ray VHS range as just a few examples. The push to domesticate film was from cinema's inception in the late 19th century. Before the mid-1970s, if audiences wanted to watch a film, they still had to wait for it to be shown on TV or appear at the cinema. There were no alternatives. Companies such as JVC and Sony recognised this, and throughout the 50s and 60s there had been many joint efforts to create an affordable VTR for business and home. In 1975, Sony released Betamax, which was quickly followed in 1976 with JVC's VHS. On release, they were primarily designed for recording off the TV, however you could purchase a limited amount of films for a significant amount of money.
These movies, they were all like $70 and $80, and I remember some rich woman coming in saying, I don't know if I should buy Nashville or MASH. And then she went, I'll buy both! And I was like, wow.
Through the 70s and into the 80s, there was a format war between the two companies, and whilst there were other contenders such as Laserdisc, and even acknowledgements that Betamax was the superior in quality, by 1981, VHS was dominating the market and had emerged an unrivaled format.
The mom and pop video stores, which were really the main, they were like bookstores. You'd go in, you'd browse, you'd find an interesting title. It might be Bloodsucking Freaks, or it might be the Queen Elizabeth story, but there was a variety.
Mom and pop stores were independent VHS rental shops where you could rent the recent releases or straight-to-video indie works. However, in 1985, Blockbuster entered the market and brought with it the beginning of the end.
Blockbuster and a couple of these other chains got together with the film companies and said, if we can raise the wholesale price up, and I think Die Hard was the one they did it with, where it was some astronomical amount wholesale, all the mom and pop stores could afford is one damn tape. And where Blockbuster had 60 days to pay, they could get 20, 30 copies.
How could you buy 6 copies at $99 of a movie that's going to have legs for 2 weeks, and then they're going to want the next first-run movie? So that's what killed the mom-and-pop stores.
DVD was developed in 1995, and by the end of the 90s was slowly beginning to take over the VHS market.
Stores, you know, just small-mindedly started to ditch all of their VHS. Like, yes, we have DVD, like, it's here. And they just started making room for the DVD stuff, really, you know, brazenly destroying their stock of VHS tapes, regardless of whether or not these tapes were movies that had become available on DVD.
By the mid-2000s, several retailers in the US and Europe announced they were to stop selling VHS, and March 2006 saw the last major VHS release, A History of Violence.
Our first VideOdyssey for the day, VideOdyssey Beaconsfield. And was it good?
Yes, it was.
They were getting rid of all their videos, so this is what we've ended up with so far.
Tapeheads were aware of the danger the format was in at the time, so when the independent rental stores lost to Blockbuster, and in the early 2000s when shops were eagerly disposing of VHS to make way for DVD, Collectors dove in and bought up stock in bulk.
I kind of panicked and was just like, well, I don't think this movie Ruben and Ed is going to be on DVD anytime soon because it was a huge flop. So I better buy this, while they're getting rid of it. And that's what started my collection. It wasn't like the same thing that drives me in collecting comics or other things, but really just the fear that these movies were just going to be completely unavailable, which is still totally valid.
As part of this study, a survey of 48 people was taken from various online VHS communities. Whilst the bulk of tapeheads had collected their VHS in the format's heyday, there was a noticeable portion that had started collecting in the past 7 years. Today, most second-hand and charity shops have stopped carrying VHS tapes. As a result, the main bulk of VHS collecting is now on the internet. Most writings on the contemporary nostalgia boom correlate the increase of collecting to the internet. Lincoln Geraghty, in his opening to the book Cult Collectors, wrote, "What the web has done is make history more accessible, our memories more tangible, thus bringing the past into the present. Not only is collecting tied to the ability to purchase, but the ability to recall the historical or nostalgic object. This brings to question the validity of nostalgia. Does the total recall aspect of the internet induce a fleeting instant nostalgia for childhood objects, or is there a significance to the nostalgia attached to VHS?" Nostalgia is not a new concept. The word nostalgia, though Greek in its roots for return home and longing, was first coined in 1688 by Swiss doctor Johann Hofer. It was then treated as a serious epidemic that struck soldiers who, away from their native land, obsessively longed for home. In the 19th century, Europe was caught in their own nostalgic trend, creating fake, dilapidated ruins, known as ruin follies, in celebration of past national glories, and by the late 19th century, nostalgia had become more patriotic and romantic. Svetlana Boym, a leading academic on the subject, wrote, "Nostalgia as a historical emotion came of age at the time of Romanticism and is coeval with the birth of mass culture. It began with the early 19th century memory boom that turned the salon culture of educated urban dwellers and landowners into a ritual commemoration of lost youth, lost springs, lost dances, lost chances." Boym went on to categorize nostalgia into two groups, reflective and restorative. Restorative nostalgia manifests itself in total reconstructions of monuments of the past, while reflective nostalgia lingers on ruin, the patina of time and history, in the dreams of another place and another time. When a tapehead collects VHS, it is a form of reflective nostalgia, built upon individual and cultural memory. Information discovered in the aforementioned survey shows that all participants had VHS prior to its downfall in the early 2000s, and 83% had experiences with VHS before the age of 10. Participators were asked if they collected other memorabilia such as comics and video games, and 99.4% responded positive. In relation to nostalgia, historian Gary Cross believed, "Nostalgia emerged fully only when people found an accelerating rate of change in many things so frustrating and alienating that they tried to capture the fleeting past in their ephemeral culture and goods. It may seem strange that we seek stability in what lasted only briefly when we were young, but as we age, our experiences as children and teens seem to be timeless, even if they were only the songs by the Rolling Stones, while the latest thing today seems merely fleeting and confusing. The appearance of digital media and streaming and the threat it brings to physical media does seem fleeting and confusing, as Cross puts it, and each of the participants of the survey and interviews speak of nostalgia and memories of childhood collections." However, Boym argues that nostalgia for a past object isn't for the object itself.
And nostalgia is often perceived as longing for home, longing for space, but it's really longing for another time or different rhythm of time. So it's very important to think, what's the antidote of modernity? Do we want to go back somewhere to some utopian golden age, to the other space? So for me, there are two different concepts, perhaps modernity and modernization. Modernity, which is a term coined by Baudelaire, is actually not a full embrace of modernization. It's a critique of modernization. So modernity is about becoming critical subject of modernization, industrialization, and what's going on around us. So I still embrace a project of critical modernity, but it does not exclude, but in fact enables criticism of, say, development of technology, certain development of contemporary capitalism. I do not embrace every new gadget on the market. I do not feel we have to rush with this crazy pace of time and crazy multitasking. I did an art project called Multitasking with Clouds, because I believe that there is something of a new rhythm of time that prevents critical thinking, because now this neuroscientist discovered that thinking takes time. And our contemporary culture does not allow us to take time or to make time for thinking. So this is why I go back to the whole idea of nostalgia as also longing perhaps for another rhythm of time. Perhaps we can have a slow thinking movement. There is a slow food movement in Italy.
By this definition, when tapeheads feel nostalgia for VHS, it is not for the tapes themselves, but for the slowness of the VHS experience. Reflective nostalgia means they are aware the quality of VHS is not superior to that of Blu-ray or HD streaming. The attachment to VHS is not purely aesthetic.
Probably the most nostalgic thing to me personally is the video store. Just the idea of going into a place to actually physically look at the movies before you rent them.
Me too. I mean, I miss the days going into the stores and being able to actually hold the video cassette and look at them, and that's what made you want to decide, oh, I want to rent this because of the cover.
The cover art sells it. It makes you want it, even if the movie itself is horrific.
It's the smell, it's the feel, it's the being able to open it and touch it.
Experience it, man. It was awesome. When you went to a video store, you were invested in the movie that you picked out. You went home and you watched it no matter what. Now with like Netflix and shit like that, you put it on, if it doesn't look good within 5 minutes, you just switch it off, go to the next movie. It's too easy.
It can then be argued that the nostalgia attached to VHS is not simply a desire to return to childhood in the face of fleeting and uncertain times of digital media, but a need to re-experience and appreciate a significant part of slower culture, something that Netflix and Prime do not provide. When VHS entered the home, it changed the relationship between the audience and film, which eventually led to the growth of independent companies such as Miramax. Tapes today are used as art, fan-made VHS releases of contemporary films, limited runs of cult films, and the nostalgia is manipulated to house Blu-ray versions of 80s films and pop-up rental stores for promotion of latest releases. Yet the significant role VHS once played is not lost. In Liverpool, Andy Johnson transformed part of his studio space into what has been dubbed UK's last VHS rental shop.
Whenever anybody asks me what is it about VHS that really appeals to me, it's the fact that it was the first edition really that we had. So I think it's got a need to be protected the same way as we've had this resurgence with vinyl. For me, it's the same as having your first edition of the favourite story that you've got, is having one of the big box old ex-rental tapes. That was the first thing, the first way you could ever actually own a film. Like I say, it was a watershed moment for people. I speak to gentlemen in the 70s, and when they start talking about that moment where they went from just watching films in the cinema to be able to take something home and enjoy it, this is where all the rise of horror and why horror is such a big genre, to watch something like that in your own space of your own choosing. That's part of the aesthetic, and obviously it is a lost art, the actual VHS cover art and everything. And that is as well in danger of being lost if we don't protect. I think VHS is worth preserving because it's not necessarily just the format of it or the shape or the feel. It's the fact that there are a lot of things on VHS, because it was the only thing we had for so long. That's what needs. It's the content that needs preserving. There must be millions of hours of people's home movies that have either been thrown away because they didn't have a digital copy or are in danger of being lost forever. And so if we don't have somewhere to actually, save, restore and protect, then all this kind of human memories and human lives will be lost. Our process in starting the archive is we've entered talks with a doctor of video from the Liverpool University, and the first step will actually be getting some funding together to hold a debate with various boffins on what is culturally worth protecting. And it's not down, I don't think it's down to me to decide what's worth keeping and what's not worth keeping. It's more about getting a panel, working what that is, and then getting the funding for the storage, because obviously tape needs to be protected, needs to be away from damp, and also either digitized or made so we can actually show it to anybody who wants to wander in, either rent the tape or obviously watch it in one of our screening booths.
Johnson is not alone in believing the format should be academically respected and archived. This significance was also acknowledged and explored by the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. In 2012, they held a 3-month VHS survey as part of their film series as an exploration of the impact the technology had on cinema. And in 2015, Kaplanoff librarian for American history at Yale University, David Garrett and Aaron Pratt, initiated a collection of 2,700 VHS tapes, which has since grown to nearly 6,000 according to their library website. In interview, Pratt explained, "Although some may think of VHS as obsolete, it was revolutionary at the time that it was introduced." He explained that the social dynamics surrounding movies changed as film entered the home in a more private setting. Horror movies, in particular, thrived in this format. Not feeling compelled to meet the expectations of blockbusters, directors were able to showcase their artistic and often weird creativity. Gil Bartholins, in Media and Nostalgia, wrote a chapter on digital retro photography. It touches upon applying nostalgic analog defects to digital photography to simulate hallmarks of authenticity within home videos and family photos. VHS was for many film buffs and cinephiles their first major exposure to film, and it granted them access to a wide variety of cinema. VHS was the original way to own films. Therefore, VHS is at the heart of cult film fandom. Arrow Video is a distributor of cult and horror films and maintain a very particular brand to appeal to the film buff audience. Their ident uses VHS aesthetic as a hallmark of authenticity, proof they understand and love cult film. This is further exampled in their physical releases, which contain reversible sleeves with artwork very much inspired by the outlandish VHS covers. As mentioned before, horror thrived on VHS and is the most popular genre to be collected on the format. As a result, the horror genre still carried the VHS aesthetic with it today, such as horror film news site Bloody Disgusting, recent films, and video games, despite it being technologically out of place.
Boo! Where did you find this guy?
Give me a break, Pete.
Hey, I only work with professionals.
There are many other theories to consider when deliberating the reasonings behind collecting and preserving seemingly irrelevant artifacts. Lincoln Geraghty has written on biographical collecting, and Dominic Schray on analog nostalgia and the argument of aesthetic warmth and organic scarring from repeat viewings. But this essay has argued VHS has cultural and cinematic significance in 2019 that is present and expressed through the use of VHS aesthetic as an example of cult cinephile and horror authenticity, and that whilst a driving force behind preserving VHS has been nostalgic, that nostalgia isn't a fleeting attempt to recapture childhood in the face of change, but a nostalgia for a different rhythm of time, a criticism on taking experience away from viewing film. Though not as popular as vinyl and retro video games, VHS has been kept alive, and efforts are being taken to archive and preserve that part of history. The technology may not see a full resurgence, but the format's continued relevance perhaps signals that the physical film media will not be completely replaced by digital streaming.